Good evening. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and welcome to the 30th Annual Russell B. Clark Gerontology Conference. I'm Jeremy Jorgensen, Director of the BYU Gerontology Program, and I'm joined this evening by Dr. Karen Fingerman of the University of Texas at Austin and Dr. Beth Fauth of Utah State University. I appreciate the time they have taken to be with us this evening. I will introduce these guests in a few minutes. We welcome BYU students across many disciplines this evening. We also welcome gerontology minor students, faculty affiliates of the gerontology program, and those that have donated resources to support the gerontology program. Thanks to donations, we're able to provide student scholarships and awards to students who are learning about and serving older adults during their undergraduate and graduate education. I especially thank the Russell B. Clark family for their support of the gerontology program across the years, and particularly for their support of this conference. For those that joined between 6:30 and now, you were able to hear the wonderful New Horizons Orchestra, really inspiring, presented by Sam Sagawa and Allison Taylor. We appreciate their efforts and their wonderful music and talents of the orchestra members. Thank you so much. 1 year ago, last week, we decided to cancel our 2020 conference due to the spreading of the coronavirus. Although it's been a challenging year for all of us, I'm grateful that we get to hear from speakers that were originally scheduled to share with us last year. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to submit them in the Q&A window during the presentations, but we will actually not take questions until all three of the presentations are done. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Elizabeth or Beth Fauth, Associate Professor in Human Development and Family Studies at Utah State University. Dr. Fauth received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Syracuse University and her master's and PhD in Human Development and Family Studies from Penn State University. Currently, Dr. Fauth teaches undergraduate and graduate classes in gerontology and is the graduate coordinator in her department. She conducts research on stress and well-being in family caregivers of people with dementia, developing and evaluating psychoeducational and therapeutic interventions for dementia caregivers, and studies staff interactions, emotions, and activities that promote quality of life in people with dementia. She also studies psychological and social correlates of functional ability and performance of everyday activities in late life. Dr. Fauth and I met while studying at Penn State and have crossed paths since then at many gerontology conferences. I've always been impressed with her excellent research, and I'm happy that she's able to join with us this evening. Welcome, Dr. Fauth.
Thank you so much. I will try to share my screen now and we can start the presentation. While I'm doing that, I just also want to say thank you for this opportunity. Collaborate really well with BYU up at Utah State. Wish I could see people in person. We do miss the old format of being able to see people face to face, but this is a fantastic alternative. So yeah, my presentation is about caregivers of people with dementia. And in general, I think you'll see from the theme here that caregivers are doing incredibly valuable work and are reluctant to ask for help. So that's why I titled this Supporting Our Biggest Supporters. Sort of the job of all of us in this community is to try to get these caregivers the support that they need so that they can do such an important job. So as many of you are aware, the rates of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias are increasing. We have people living longer than ever. And one of the results of that is this increase in Alzheimer's because it is an age-related disease. So for example, just in the state of Utah, in a 5-year period from 2020 to 2025, we expect to see a 23.5% increase in Alzheimer's disease. So when we say increase, it is definitely increasing. I have a lot of people ask me what's the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So I always want to start there so we're on the same page. Alzheimer's disease is the most common kind of dementia. We say that dementia is basically an umbrella term in that there's many different kinds of dementia, with Alzheimer's being the most common. So we tend to use these terms kind of interchangeably throughout this presentation. I may say dementia or Alzheimer's, recognizing it's kind of like saying Kleenex and tissues, right? Kleenex is a well-known brand of tissues, and sometimes you can use those interchangeably. So When I talk about Alzheimer's, I really generally mean the bigger term of Alzheimer's disease and dementias that are similar to it. One of the unique things about dementia is that it is progressive and it is a long course of disease. So generally caregivers are caring for their loved one between 5 and 20 years, 20 being quite extreme. That's not as common, but when we're talking about care provided over years and not months, then we certainly can understand sort of the chronic stress that caregivers are under. People associate Alzheimer's and dementia with memory loss, and certainly that's the most pronounced symptom. But as I'm going to show you next, there's a lot of other symptoms that make this a particularly challenging condition for people to live with and to care for. If you've heard the myth, or you've heard people say things like people in the United States don't take care of their older adults, you can be the one to correct them gently and tactfully that yes, caregivers, family members are providing the vast majority of the care for older people in the United States. So in the US, only around 5% of people age 65 and older live in nursing homes or assisted living. When I ask my students what they think the percent is, they often say up to 40%. So most people are living at home. The majority, so 70% of caregivers, family caregivers, have no paid help. So they're doing it entirely on their own. And the next batch is people that have a combination of both paid and unpaid. There's very few people that are relying only on paid help. And you know, caregivers often are doing this alone. We refer to them as primary caregivers because there's often one person providing the vast majority of care. Here's a statistic that came from AARP that said that 47% of caregivers say that no one else provided any unpaid help for their loved one in the last 12 months. So again, they're doing a lot and they're doing it alone. And finally, some caregiving kind of starts off kind of more mild or you know, a few hours a week, dropping in on mom and dad. But 40% of caregivers are doing what we call high intensity caregiving, which means they're in this role the vast majority of the day, and maybe sometimes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. As I mentioned, there's these behavioral and psychological symptoms that come with dementia. Others call this the neuropsychiatric symptoms. But essentially, there's some research that we did up at Utah State on a Utah sample that showed that we could predict whether a caregiver had clinically significant depressive symptoms with 72% accuracy based only on whether these behavioral and psychological symptoms were present or absent. And recognizing that depression is caused by many things, it's much more than just a caregiving experience. We were very surprised to find out that these behavioral and psychological symptoms are really influencing depression to a large extent in this population. There's other aspects of providing care that can be difficult. So in a separate study, we found that that 2/3 of caregivers, dementia caregivers, reported that their loved one resisted when they were providing care. And it wasn't really the provision of care that was related to these negative outcomes like overload, burden, or depressive symptoms. It was the resistance of the care that was more predictive of these outcomes. So what we say, or what we can conclude from this, is it's not that caregivers have a difficult or have these sort of negative emotional outcomes because they're providing care. It's because of the difficulties and challenges with symptoms of the disease that really exacerbate their stress and make things much worse for caregivers. So here we have just a diagram here where there's lots of research that supports this relationship between chronic stress, so exposure to these behavioral symptoms, and also there's some interesting research that's not about just the exposure to the problems, but how stressful caregivers perceive the problems to be. And so with this kind of general relationship, this kind of guides a lot of my research. It gives us a good point of intervention. So if we know that the chronic stress is leading to depressive symptoms and poor health in our caregivers, then we can do something about the process, either to reduce the exposure to the behaviors or to try to improve caregivers' perceptions of these behaviors. And so one area of research which is quite promising when we say, how do we help? How do we intervene? A very effective intervention is respite. And the definition is a pause or temporary cessation, an interval of rest. And our caregivers certainly deserve rest. Okay, so it's getting a break from the role. There are formal services like adult day services that caregivers can bring their loved one to. Much less expensive perhaps is to try to share care duties with other members of the family. We have some innovative programs up in Logan, in Cache and Rich counties. We have a program that's paused a little bit right now because of COVID, but where we have trained older volunteers that will go in and sit in the home so that the caregivers can get a break for a few hours, leave the house and go do something else. So we provide respite through volunteers. And people can contact their area agency on aging offices. So this is a little bit of a busy graph here, but I just wanted to show you this interesting study that was done by my colleague at Utah State. She was able to show that these stressful biomarkers, so things like hormones, like cortisol is a stress hormone, we can compare people on days where they've used respite and not used respite. And we can show that the stress patterns are much better on days where caregivers can get a break. A really common intervention is what we call psychoeducational interventions. Caregivers need to know about the disease. They need to know what to expect. They need to know which symptoms are likely to occur and some innovative ways to help resolve those challenges. Psychoeducational interventions can also be used to try to get others on board. So in a family intervention, typically it's trying to get other family members to take over some of the work so that it's not relying just on the single primary caregiver. And of course, teaching caregivers some stress management techniques is highly effective. This is results from a study done in Utah and in 3 other states. And we were able to show through a family intervention where caregivers were meeting with a counselor in 2 individual sessions and then with their family members for 4 sessions, so 6 total. And we could see that caregivers showed reduced family conflict, increased satisfaction with their social support network, and increased quality of life by attending these psychosocial interventions. And these were sustained over a year. So even after these sort of 6 sessions, which occurred over a few weeks, a year later, we were still seeing sustained benefits. There's another program we're doing in Logan right now where we're taking a form of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, and we have adapted it for an online self-help intervention. Typically ACT is done with a therapist, but it's not very cost effective and a lot of people don't want to attend therapy. So we're trying to see if we can build skills in this area through these 10 sessions that take about 20 minutes each. And our pilot research on this has also shown really positive benefits across every outcome that we measured. So depressive symptoms decreased, positive aspects of caregiving increased, and so on. So here we are back to this idea that we can intervene. And I'm hoping that by some of the data that I've shown you, including work that's been done in Utah, that we are able to try to buffer the stress relationship between this chronic exposure to stress and these poor outcomes for caregivers. And so in general, what we know works really well is to give caregivers a break, right? To give them respite. We also can teach caregivers how to prevent behavioral symptoms from arising. So managing difficult behaviors a little better so that they don't come back or that they resolve quicker. And helping caregivers with their reactivity to stress. So helping them to perceive that these behaviors are not quite as stressful. And it doesn't mean that we minimize the experience of caregivers. In fact, we don't want them to avoid their thoughts. We don't ACT teaches us that we want people to be very present focused, meaning if the behavioral symptom is happening, don't worry about the past or the future, sort of focus on the moment. And that can help resolve kind of the added tricks that your brain tends to play on you when you're in a state of kind of heightened stress. So for this audience, for everyone here, if you know someone that is a caregiver, there's some pretty easy sort of take-home messages here. If you want to support a caregiver, one of the best things you can do is offer them some respite. So offer times that you can go in and visit with their loved ones so they can get a break. And offer to help in other ways in a sort of consistent and regular way. So saying like, you know, every other Thursday I'll come by and I'll help mow the lawn, or I will take you know, your husband out to lunch so you can get a break, but and we'll do this once a month. So something that caregivers can grow to expect. Also, hopefully from this presentation, you've learned that there are really good services available. And so talking to caregivers about these opportunities and encouraging them to use resources that are available, it's very difficult to do this job alone. And we have really good support that works really well. Our interventions do work and we have the data to support that. Also, as a reminder that for somebody who's struggling with a very difficult dementia situation, that institutionalized care is not failure, and asking for help through paid services is not a failure. And it's sometimes very important for the caregivers, both mental and physical health. And finally, you know, caregivers need to vent. They need to be able to talk about how difficult things can be for them. And so being a patient listener and helping them realize they don't need to be the sort of bubbly optimist and everything's going to be okay kind of attitude. There's a lot of stuff with this acceptance and commitment therapy that teaches us that we shouldn't be avoiding our difficult thoughts. We sort of just need to become more comfortable with them so that they don't spin off into some more disruptive behaviors. And that is my presentation. So I feel like I went very fast and I have a lot more that I'd love to talk about. I have my email at the bottom here. So if anybody wants to reach out and learn more about some opportunities in Utah or just in general, please feel free to email me.
Thank you so much, Beth. I want to clap and let everybody else clap too, although we can't hear them. Appreciate you sharing that very meaningful and impactful work. I feel like what you're doing is really helping caregivers. In fact, I made a note here. I'm going to do those things for a caregiver that I know that I hadn't thought of before your presentation. So appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm grateful to now be able to share some of my own research. And as a brief introduction, I'll share that I completed a master's degree at Kansas State University and PhD at Virginia Tech, both in marriage and family therapy. I then completed postdoctoral work at Penn State with an emphasis on mental health and aging. I'm currently a faculty member in the School of Family Life, and I teach classes on adult development and aging, family stress and resilience, and advanced statistics. My main research efforts focus on understanding how couples manage health concerns, and I also study some grandparent-grandchild relationships and the transition to retirement. With that, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm excited to share some work tonight about how health or illness and health behaviors relate to marital quality in later life for older couples, and appreciates funding that I've received from the Veterans Administration Office of Rural Health and the Gerontology program, and as well as support from wonderful students and colleagues on some of the research that I'll be sharing here tonight. I was thinking about asking the question, what are things that couples in later life share together? And one of the things we know they share is meals. They eat together. Sometimes they do leisure activities together. And sometimes they share a living residence. Oftentimes they do. And but how about, oops, let's see. How about chronic illness? Is this something that's shared if one of them has a chronic illness like cancer or COPD or diabetes or arthritis? Is that something that impacts the couple relationship, or is it just belong to one person? And what about exercise? When couples exercise or when one person exercises, is that something that has an impact on the relationship? And those are the two things that I'm going to address here today. I lived with my grandpa for one semester when I was an undergraduate student. These are my grandparents here on my mom's side. My grandmother was in a nursing home at the time. And I remember being surprised that my grandpa often spoke in terms of we, and he was referring, of course, to his wife. And at the time, I just thought, well, that's kind of interesting, but I appreciate now that that was a symbol in a way of his relationship with his wife. And that couple relationships take on a meaning of their own that's very important. We have some theoretical work that has addressed how couples in a unified way are affected by illness. Some work by Berg and Upchurch. Here they have this model where dyads or couples appraise an illness, where they cope and they adjust, and notice all the arrows, everything's connected with everything else. And these processes play out in a dyadic way. More recently, Helgeson and colleagues have talked about communal coping, where an illness is our problem and people work together to solve problems and provide support to one another. And so we have a theoretical grounding for thinking about illness in terms of couple relationships. Some work that I've done has shown that, and actually this has been substantiated in a number of studies, that illness affects marital quality. And we found that it's especially challenging when a spouse is ill, or that is, it affects the marital quality of someone when their spouse is ill rather than themselves. And people that have an illness, oftentimes they benefit from the relationship in different ways. When the husband is the ill spouse, that tends to not go over as well, or it's more difficult for the wife. When wives are ill, oftentimes husbands in later life, they now have an opportunity to connect with their wife in different ways than they've done in the past. When couples are younger and illness is not so much expected, it tends to have more of a negative impact. And I will say these results are mixed. That is, sometimes when there's an illness in marriage, it brings couples closer together. And so I want to acknowledge that. In the current study I'm going to show you, I want to talk about how daily physical symptoms are related to interactions within marriage, and also what things might buffer a health stressor. And particularly, I'm going to look at spiritual or religious, some kind of meaningful influence on someone's day. I'm going to share a little bit from a second study looking at exercise. Research on illness in marriage is definitely growing, and there's a good body of research there. However, fewer people are looking at the benefits of healthy behaviors like exercise in relationships. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. When people exercise, we feel good, we're healthier. It affects our neurotransmitters in positive ways, helps us to respond to stress. And so exercise, we know that there are a lot of benefits from it, but are there relationship benefits for it? And what if we exercise as a couple? Does that have even additional benefits? So I'll address those questions. The data that I'm going to show you comes from a study, a daily diary study for 14 days that's housed within this larger study. In 1966, Von Kahl, Luther Otto, and Kenneth Spenner, they started up the early parts of the study. And I'll say Von Kahl, he came in 1980 there, but this started out as a study of careers from high school seniors in the state of Washington. And they did a follow-up in 1980 and then rebranded in 2010, calling this the Life and Family Legacies Study, with over 3,000 people participating. And we went in 2011 and got a random stratified sample of people that were married or in a marriage-like relationship, and asked them to fill out surveys about their relationship, about their health. And this is where we got information that we could look at to see how are older couples dealing with these kinds of things. This study continues on, and right now they're carrying out cognitive screens and collecting saliva samples from a part of the sample. So really, it's an amazing data set. And I'm just going to report on the daily diary stuff here mentioned. So 559 of these couples were invited to participate, and they were mixed by health, residence, and military status. And 191 couples returned usable surveys from both spouses that were on matched days that we could compare. And with all of the surveys we received back, we have over 5,000 days of surveys from these couples that we looked at. And to give you an idea about this sample, so we have people in their early 60s. They have on average a college education and about $88,000 a year, and about 55% of the sample is in their first marriage, and many of these are long-term marriage with an average length of 30 years. So this is a little higher SES sample, but still amazing in many ways. The main outcome that we're looking at here is, well, there are two. One is positive marital events, where we look at if your spouse said something nice to you that made you feel loved or helped you out with something or comforted you, showed interest in the events of your day, things like this. And then negative marital events, where looked at if there was an argument or if you felt criticized or if a spouse let you down, these types of things. Predictors in this study, I'm first going to look at physical health symptoms, these that you see on the screen. Of course, at the time we didn't ask about COVID, but I'm sure we'll see some research on COVID in marriage in the near future. And then regarding religious or spiritual influence, we asked how much of an influence were your religious or spiritual activities on your day to day, and looked at that as a moderator. Let's see, regarding exercise, I'm kind of flipping back and forth between these two studies because we use the same data set. But regarding exercise, we asked them if they exercised each of the 14 days. And the within person, I'm going to use a little bit of jargon here. Within person refers to, did I exercise today? And between person refers to my average of exercise across the 14 days. And that's usually compared between the other people. So within person looks at the effect of my exercise today on my outcomes today, and between person compares me with other people in the sample. Okay, I won't talk a lot about the analysis, but I will say that because these couples are married and because they filled out surveys multiple days in a row, we had to take that into account, that those things are correlated. And we expected that on days with higher symptoms that couples would have poorer marital outcomes, and that daily religious or spiritual influence would benefit marital outcomes, and that it would also buffer symptoms as they related to marital outcomes. And the findings, these are all from the same model, but I broke them up into different slides to just make it a little easier to digest. First of all, we see an interesting finding that when husbands reported more symptoms, they also reported more positive marital interactions. And that was contrary to what we expected. But to me, this is evidence that wives are helping out. So the husband's having a lot of symptoms more than he typically does. And wives are probably increasing in positive marital interactions those days to help out. Regarding negative marital interactions, we see that physical symptoms for husbands, if they have more symptoms than they regularly do, that's related to more negative marital interactions. And people that had more physical symptoms on average also reported more negative marital interactions. So physical symptoms can be hard in marriage. Looking at religious influence, we see a pretty consistent pattern here that religious influence, both within person, like was it influential for me today or more today than my average, and between person, people who report religious influence more on average than other people are reporting more positive marital interactions. Let's see, whoops, wrong direction. We also see this, this is kind of an interesting effect. We call it a partner effect, where when husbands reported more spiritual or religious influence, wives are reporting more positive marital interactions. We see the same with negative marital interactions for wives, where they're reporting fewer of those with more religious influence on a given day. And then that bottom red box there is again that partner effect for husbands. When the husbands are reporting more spiritual influence, the wives are reporting fewer negative marital interactions. And then I want to highlight this one here that shows that that religious influence for wives was actually a buffer to their physical symptoms. And this is a picture of what it looks like. I'll focus on the top line here. On the y-axis, we have negative marital interactions. And on the x-axis, we have low symptom days and high symptom days. And when we compare low symptom days to high symptom days, those with low religious influence have higher negative marital interactions on high symptom days. So this suggests that if you have a higher religious or spiritual influence on that day, that it's a buffer. Okay, now very quickly, I'm going to jump to the exercise study. where we expected with exercise that marital outcomes would improve, and that with conjoint exercise, when couples exercise together, that their marital outcomes would improve as well. Sorry, you guys, I'm talking really fast, hoping to get through everything here. I tend to do too much here, but hopefully it's exciting. Okay, so here, what we see here is that for wives that exercise, we see in the red boxes, when wives exercise, they're also reporting higher positive marital interactions on those days. Husbands did not report that, and there were no partner effects where wives or husbands exercised and it affected the partner's reports of positive marital interactions. We also see that when wives exercise more on average, that they also are reporting more positive marital interactions. When couples exercise together, there was an effect for both spouses' reports of positive marital interactions, where both of them reported that they went up. Wives also reported fewer negative marital interactions on those days that there was exercise. These are both within person effects. So what it kind of suggests is that exercise, the impact of exercise only lasts for that day. It doesn't spill over to the next day. So we got to keep exercising. Okay, so I'll take a deep breath and say, what do we take away from here, from these two studies? For the first study, if we get sick, we can recognize that that will have an impact on our partner and on our marriage. If you have a wife, be grateful for likely support from her on sick days. If you're a husband, be sensitive to a wife on sick days. And I would add to that, offer support. Where we didn't see that effect there, but that doesn't mean that in certain relationships, those don't occur. We can change that, we can intervene. We also see that meaningful spiritual or religious influence can help on sick days. Regarding exercise, we say that it's beneficial in some ways. Husband's daily exercise isn't necessarily linked to marital interactions, but when couples exercise together, we see a consistent pattern of benefits. And so I would encourage this kind of thing. Let's see, although we didn't see a benefit, a between person benefit on conjoint exercise, meaning exercising more versus less between people in the sample didn't necessarily have an effect. It was on the days that couples exercised together, then there was an effect. So again, I guess I already said that. We can't expect it to carry over to the next day. One of the interesting things we see here is a gender difference for wives and husbands. And some of the research shows that emotional transmission, that when emotions carry over from one spouse to another, wives are a little more in tune with those. And so I guess husbands, we can step up and try and be a little more alert and attentive. Thank you very much. I went kind of quickly there. Thank you, Karen. I will now, let's see, we'll now move to our third presenter. Dr. Karen Fingerman is a professor of human development and family sciences at UT Austin. She studies adult development and aging and is the founding director of the Texas Aging and Longevity Center. She also oversees the graduate portfolio in aging and health at UT Austin. Her research has asked how relationships with family members, friends, and acquaintances change from young adulthood to old age, with particular attention to emotional qualities of ties and support exchanges. Dr. Fingerman directed the Family Exchanges Study, a longitudinal study involving middle-aged adults, their romantic partners, grown children, and aging parents, multiple generations. This project has shown the ways in which midlife adults negotiate demands and connections with generations above and below, as well as considering the implications of family ties for young adults and older adults. Dr. Fingerman is currently conducting the NIA-funded Daily Experiences and Well-Being in Later Life study, looking at over 300 older adults' social relationships and physical and cognitive functioning in a daily context, using a variety of sensory and ecologically valid assessments. Similar to Dr. Fauth, I have crossed paths with Dr. Fingerman throughout the last several years. I have admired her work and happy that we can hear from her now. Welcome, Dr. Fingerman.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I do want to say that those talks were just amazing, Beth and Jeremy. Next time I'm going to ask to go first so I don't have to follow you, because those were just great. And I am pleased to have the opportunity to be here with you and present some. And I may refer back to Dr. Jorgensen's talk as I go through. I'm going to be talking about family and the technical milieu, TV viewing in late life. Interestingly, we talk a lot about screen time for children, particularly during this pandemic, where it's been a saving element for many families. But there's also screen time in late life, and television is the main screen time in late life. Still, television, we think of it as old-fashioned and out of date, but for people over 65, it is still very much a part of their lives. And on average, they watch 7 hours of television a day. So it's really very pervasive and very important. And yet we know very little about the role that it plays, particularly with regard to family, because that seems like those two things would go together. Interestingly, I'm going to talk a little bit about couples in a minute. And as Dr. Jorgensen pointed out in his talk, they do spend their leisure time together often. TV is associated with a couple of things that are well, first of all, it's associated with sedentary behavior. So it is the opposite of sort of Dr. Jorgensen's information about exercise. I'm looking a little bit at what's going on when you're really lazy and that TV is on. The other thing that it is associated with is loneliness. And here it's complicated. It's not clear whether people watch television because they are lonely or they get lonely watching television, or even if those two things go together. And so that's an interesting question. We know that when people in a study where they just ask you, how much have you watched TV this year? And you say, a lot. And how lonely are you? I'm very lonely. Those two things go together, but do they actually occur together?
Karen,
Yeah.
your screen, I don't think you're sharing your screen.
Oh, gosh, let me try again. I thought I had. Okay,
there
sorry.
We go. There we go. Perfect.
Okay,
No,
let me catch you all up then. Okay, so they watch 7.5 hours. TV and sedentary behavior. So here we go. We're going the fast way through these. This loneliness thing. Are they lonely? How do those two ideas fit together? And then what happens throughout the day? How does TV fit into family life? So again, like Dr. Jorgensen, I'm very interested in life as it's lived on a daily basis. And in this study, that's what we wanted to know, was how do these two things fit together? Now, one possibility is that people watch TV alone, and they do it for companionship. This may also be the case that people who live alone watch more TV, and the people who live alone in late life are going to be more likely to be those who are widowed or perhaps divorced. When people have a spouse, they're likely to watch that TV with a spouse for a variety of reasons, including, as Dr. Jorgensen pointed out, they often live in the same household. It's a patterned activity. They're comfortable doing something that you do, every day at 10, we watch this game show or whatever it is. And you're comfortable being sedentary with your closest ties, particularly those you live with. With less close ties, it requires movement. They introduce you to new situations. They make you do diverse behaviors. And even if you have them over to your house, it requires that you get up out of your chair. Being sedentary is one of the biggest problems in late life, and it is a known risk for mortality. So just getting you up and about is what happens with less close ties. But we predicted that spouses and close ties would have you watching TV a lot more. We did this study, as Dr. Jorgensen mentioned, the Daily Experiences and Wellbeing Study. We did it in the greater Austin area, which actually is quite a large area. We have rural, suburb, urban. We have a very large mix of different microcosm of the country almost. We did a 2-hour initial interview for 333 of these people. Afterwards, we put a number of devices on them for 5 to 6 days. And I'm going to go through each of these devices with you. But basically, we were tracking a number of different activities in their daily life as it occurred. And we have a slightly lower number here because I could give you a whole lecture on technology failures. If you put multiple devices on people, they're going to fail in different proportions. So the number we actually got everything on was 313. These were primarily aged older. They were all at least age 65. We had a nice range. We also had a nice range on health, although they were generally healthy because they lived in the community. They were more educated than the general population, but Austin is a very educated population. So half of our population over age 65 has a college education, as did our sample. And about 60% of them were married and 40% of them weren't. And I'm going to be looking at whether they lived alone or not, which is really more or less the same thing in this study. Okay, so I told you I would talk about each of the devices. We had something called an electronically activated recorder. And what that is we gave everybody a handheld device. We used an Android for a variety of reasons having to do with programming. And that way everyone had the same device and we could, train them on it and so on, because a lot of these people had never dealt with this kind of a smartphone-like device. On it, there was an app that recorded 30 seconds out of every 7 minutes of sound in the environment. And we generated 158,000 sound files, 80% of which had sound, because, sometimes there's silence. And so we coded those for television viewing. The coders were 99-point-something% agreement. We had 2 people code each sound file. And that was only because someone wasn't paying attention when they disagreed. It was very rare, and that got easily resolved. We took those and turned it into codes in the past 3 hours, was the television playing in the last 3 hours. And you'll see in a minute why we did that. I just wanted to show you, this is the sound waves from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. of our average participant. And the brown is television viewing. And the rainbow is conversation. So you can see that there is a lot of television viewing compared to actual human conversation and interaction. We did also what are called ecological momentary assessments. They're EMA. They sound really fancy. And basically, it's just a self-report every 3 hours. So that little device would pop up a set of questions every 3 hours, which is why we looked at television viewing every 3 hours, because our other information was at every 3 hours. What have you been doing? Who have you been with? And we had a lot of information. In the baseline interview, we had something called the convoy measure, and we transferred all the information from that onto the handheld device. So we knew who they encountered. They could also report on people who weren't those 10. But for those 10, we know every time it was the spouse or the child or the friends. And then if they reported someone who wasn't in that convoy measurement, they could still say, oh, yes, it's my friend or my acquaintance. So every 3 hours, they gave us that information: friend, acquaintance, extended family, and who else they had been with. I just want to point this out because later when I analyze the data, show you the analyses, this is how we grouped it. Were they alone? Were they with a spouse? Were they with other family? Were they with friends? And were they with others like strangers, acquaintances, your doctor, your neighbors even might be listed there? We asked whether it was in person, by phone, or by text. And again, that's every 3 hours. Now, when we look at who's alone, they're going to be alone in person. So you could be watching television and, talking on the phone, or you're sitting there texting, particularly if you have teenagers. That's pretty much the way it goes. Not so many of our old people were doing that, but we did know if they were. Now, this device is called an Actical, and you wear it on your wrist. It looks a lot like a watch or a Fitbit, but it's really fancy version of that. It has multiple what are called accelerometers, which is what is in your Fitbit, but there's many of them, so they can actually get a very precise measurement. And from that, we looked at the proportion of time that they were sedentary in the past 3 hours. And then we looked at their total activity count. And again, that's a very precise measurement. It measures every minute, and we could look at how active they were and how sedentary they are. They're not opposites, because if you think about it, like I'm sitting here right now, and I might, be sitting here for 90 minutes, but then maybe I'll go out for a run for a half hour. So I was very active, and my total activity will look high, but I also spent a lot of it sedentary. So you can look and see how those go together. Well, when we looked at the television viewing, our participants spent about 6.4 hours on average. That was 37% of their waking hours. We coded television. It's a lot. It's not as high as that 7 hours on average that I was talking about at the beginning, but it's a lot of their waking time. We did something called a multi-level model, which accounts for the fact that people, have a lot of different responses. And so we're just kind of finding a way to make sure that someone who answered 50 surveys doesn't pull our findings compared to someone who only did 10, because not everyone did the same number of surveys. People skip them and things. But regardless, that finding is there, that when they are alone, they're much more likely to watch TV. So that was there. You might have thought, well, of course, but it hadn't ever been observed. And a lot of things we expect, we don't find. Interestingly, they do watch it more with their spouse, and they are less likely to watch with other family, friends, or acquaintances. This intergenerational are their grown kids, and it's probably the fact that their grown kids sometimes come over and they just sit on the couch, whereas maybe they're more likely to get out and about with these other people. So it's less likely here and more likely with the spouse or alone. Okay, I won't show you these findings. I'm just going to tell you, and I think that they're really, I can show you them another time with all the models, but basically when people are watching TV, they are more lonely. They are more sedentary and they are less active on average. Most people, this is what it looks like. When you look at it by residential status, do they live alone? Well, as we said before, once you look at this with living alone included, television viewing makes you more lonely, but it gets complicated on living alone. It makes you, living alone, this is what's called an interaction effect. I'm going to show you this, but it makes you less active, but the patterns are complex. And what you find here for loneliness is that if you live alone, television viewing, a greater proportion of television viewing is associated with greater reports of loneliness. Not living alone, basically you live with a spouse, maybe a grown child, maybe both. TV viewing has no association with your loneliness. It's only for those who live alone. It suggests that maybe they're trying to turn on the television because they feel alone, and it's not helping. It's just not helping. And their loneliness is just even maybe feeling worse because they can't get rid of it. Now, the activity is more complicated. So what happens with activity here is that if you live alone, you're less active the more TV. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. If you live with someone else, so this is the people with their spouse, probably, or their grown child. They are the ones who are more likely to be sedentary, less active, more television. There's not as strong an effect when you live alone. Why is that? Why is it that if you live alone and you have the TV on, you're not showing any effect on your activity? Well, it could be, I call this the CNN at the airport effect. It could be that when you live alone, you just have the TV on in the background and you're running around, getting to your gate or doing whatever. But if you live with a spouse, you turn on the TV and the two of you kind of sit there because it's a way of feeling like a couple, but not having to be actively engaged or in each other's presence. It's a passive, it can be relaxing. TV is not only a source of loneliness and such. In summary, TV is still the screen of choice in late life. As we see more and more research on the internet, and we see more and more older adults need to use the internet, we need to train them in things. We need to recognize they already have a screen they like a whole lot, and it's a part of their lives, and we probably need to consider that. The associations observed sort of in those big studies of, yes, I'm lonely, yes, I watch a lot of TV, they are occurring when you observe it in the moment. It's not just that people are, a constellation of people do both. It's that when you watch TV, you feel more lonely. When you watch TV, you're less active. But there are different effects on living alone. And so again, if we were thinking about who shouldn't, what it means to watch TV, it depends. Are you married? Are you, doing some of the things that Dr. Jorgensen was talking about, or are you widowed or alone in some way? And so I guess I would say we need more research on television, and we need more research on understanding people who are alone in late life, and perhaps more so during the pandemic, because people who are alone a lot more. I do want to acknowledge the funding that I've had for this and the support I've had. And I also, I should have mentioned at the start that I have doctoral students and collaborators who helped with this study, and I'm very grateful to them. And I want to thank you for your time. And especially I want to thank Dr. Jorgensen for including me in this.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was wonderful. I'll clap
Thanks.
for you. Everybody else is clapping in front of their computer screens for you as well. Wonderful. So applicable to so many lives. I'll remind everyone that our keynote address of this conference will be tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. on the same Zoom link that we're using now. Dr. Karen Fingerman will share additional research of hers at that time, looking above and below intergenerational relationships at midlife. Thank you both again so much. We'll see you all later. We'll go ahead and sign off now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Great to meet you guys.